She knelt in the mud beside the armored transport, her uniform soaked through with rain and something darker. 3 men lay unconscious in the vehicle's twisted wreckage, their breathing shallow, their wounds bleeding freely into the Afghan soil. The radio crackled with static and distant voices calling for evacuation that wouldn't come for hours. Maybe not at all. She looked at the tree line 2 kilometers away, then at the men who had called her backpack for the past 6 months. The same men who were about to discover what those shoulders could carry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The firebase sat like a scar against the mountainside, all concrete barriers and razor wire cutting through the morning haze. Dust hung in the air from the convoy that had returned just before dawn, vehicles grinding to a halt near the motor pool, with their engines ticking in the sudden quiet. Soldiers emerged from the trucks, with the careful movements of those who had spent too many hours on roads where every pothole might hide an explosive. Sarah Martinez stepped down from the passenger seat of the lead Humvee, her boots landing softly on the gravel. She was small by any military standard, barely 5 feet 3 inches, with narrow shoulders that seemed lost inside her body armor. Her rifle looked oversized across her back, the stock extending well past her shoulder blade. When she walked, there was no swagger, no presence that demanded attention. She moved like someone accustomed to being overlooked. The morning briefing tent buzzed with the low conversation of soldiers comparing notes from patrol. Maps covered every surface, marked with red pins and grid coordinates. Coffee steamed from metal cups mixed with the perpetual smell of diesel fuel and unwashed gear. Sarah found a seat near the back, her notebook already open, pen ready. She had learned early that taking detailed notes gave her hands something to do when the others started talking. Staff Sergeant Johnson stood at the front, pointer in hand, indicating sectors on the large tactical map. His voice carried the authority of someone who had survived 3 deployments and knew that information kept people alive. The mission was straightforward on paper. Routine patrol through the valley settlements, checking in with village elders, documenting any suspicious activity. Intelligence suggested the area was quiet, but intelligence had been wrong before. Sarah copied every detail into her notebook, sketching the route with careful precision. She noted elevation changes, distances between checkpoints, estimated travel times accounting for terrain. While other soldiers leaned back in their chairs or whispered side conversations, she calculated load weights and hydration requirements. Her handwriting was small and precise, filling every line of the page with information that might matter later. Corporal Williams, a thick-shouldered man from Texas with arms like tree branches, glanced over at her notebook and smirked. He nudged the soldier beside him, Private Chen, and pointed with his chin towards Sarah's meticulous notes. Williams had been making the same joke for months now, ever since Sarah had joined their unit. He called her backpack because, he claimed, she looked like a child wearing adult gear. Chen snickered quietly, shaking his head. Sarah's pack was indeed large compared to her frame, loaded with equipment that seemed disproportionate to her size. The medical supplies alone added 20 pounds, plus ammunition, water, rations, and the communications gear she had volunteered to carry. The total weight approached 90 pounds, nearly half her body weight, but she had never complained, never asked for adjustments, never fallen behind on patrol. The briefing concluded with standard warnings about IED activity and rules of engagement. Soldiers began filing out, checking weapons and adjusting gear. Sarah remained seated, reviewing her notes one more time, cross-referencing the patrol route with topographical details she had memorized from studying maps late into the previous night. She knew every ridge, every valley, every potential ambush point along their planned route. Williams paused beside her chair as the tent emptied. He was a good soldier, competent and experienced, but he had never outgrown the military tendency to measure worth by size and volume. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who thought he was being funny rather than hurtful. "Hey, backpack," he said, tapping her shoulder with one thick finger. "You sure you can handle your load today? We're going to be moving fast, and I don't want to be slowing down to wait for you." Sarah looked up from her notebook, her expression calm and neutral. She had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. Her voice was quiet but steady when she replied, "I'll keep up." There was no defensiveness in her tone, no anger, just a simple statement of fact. She had always kept up. She had never been the reason for delays or complications. But facts had never stopped the commentary. Chen joined the conversation, his tone lighter but no less dismissive. "Come on, Williams. Cut her some slack. She's trying her best." The word trying hung in the air with particular weight, as if her best was somehow insufficient by definition. Chen meant it as a kindness, but kindness built on the assumption of inadequacy felt worse than direct mockery. Sarah closed her notebook and stood, slinging her pack onto her shoulders in one smooth motion. The weight settled naturally across her frame, distributed through straps and padding she had adjusted countless times for maximum efficiency. She had spent hours studying load distribution, researching techniques used by mountaineers and endurance athletes. Her gear might look oversized, but every item had its place, every strap its purpose. Private Jackson, barely 18 and fresh from basic training, watched the exchange with uncomfortable silence. He was new enough to the unit that he still felt the need to prove himself, still young enough to believe that joining in with the veterans would earn him acceptance. He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Maybe we should get her a smaller pack," he suggested. "Something more her size." The comment drew chuckles from several soldiers nearby, the kind of easy laughter that came from repetition rather than genuine humor. Sarah had become a familiar target, safe to mock, because she never retaliated, never complained, never gave them reason to feel guilty about their jokes. She absorbed their commentary with the same steady composure she brought to everything else, which only seemed to encourage more of it. Sergeant Davis, a career soldier with 20 years of service, overheard the conversation as he checked his equipment nearby. He had served with small soldiers before, had seen size matter less than heart in situations that counted. His voice cut through the laughter with the authority of rank and experience. "Gear check in 10 minutes," he announced. "Save the comedy for after the mission." The group dispersed toward their vehicles, but the atmosphere lingered. Sarah walked to her assigned Humvee, the same one she had ridden in for every patrol since joining the unit. She always took the seat behind the driver, the position that gave her the best view of the terrain while staying out of the way of the more senior soldiers. Her rifle went in the bracket beside her, magazine checked, safety engaged, ready for immediate use if needed. Williams climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting mirrors with the casual confidence of someone who had driven these roads many times. Chen took the passenger seat, spreading a map across his lap, despite the GPS mounted on the dashboard. Jackson climbed in behind Williams, his nervous energy filling the small space with constant movement and adjustment. The convoy formed up in the pre-dawn darkness, 4 vehicles spaced at regulation intervals. Radio checks confirmed communication between all units. Engines rumbled to life, diesel exhaust mixing with the cool mountain air. Sarah pulled her notebook from her pocket and reviewed her route notes one final time, though she had already committed every detail to memory. The base gates opened with the grinding sound of heavy metal on metal, revealing the road that wound down from their elevated position toward the valley floor. The landscape beyond was harsh and beautiful, all rocky outcroppings and scattered vegetation adapted to extremes of heat and cold. Morning light was just beginning to touch the distant peaks, painting them in shades of gold and amber. Williams guided the Humvee through the gate and onto the dirt road that would carry them into territory where every rock might hide a threat, every turn might conceal an ambush. The armor plating around them provided protection, but also isolation from the world outside. Sarah watched the terrain scroll past through her window, comparing the actual landscape to the map she had studied, noting discrepancies and changes that might matter if they needed to navigate off-road. The radio chattered with routine communications between vehicles, position reports, and status updates delivered in the clipped professional tone of soldiers at work. Sarah listened to every transmission, maintaining her own mental picture of the convoy's movement and spacing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had volunteered to monitor communications during previous patrols, but Williams preferred to handle radio duties himself, another small reminder that her contributions were not particularly valued. 20 minutes into the patrol, the convoy reached the first checkpoint, a village of perhaps 24 buildings clustered around a well and a small marketplace. Children emerged from doorways to watch the American vehicles pass, their faces showing curiosity mixed with wariness. Some waved tentatively, others simply stared. Sarah observed their reactions, noting details that might indicate changes in local attitude or the presence of unfamiliar faces. The village elder, a man named Hassan who spoke passable English, approached the lead vehicle when they stopped. His conversation with the patrol leader was routine, covering the same topics they discussed every few weeks. Any strangers in the area, any unusual activity, any needs the village might have that the Americans could address. Hassan's responses were consistent with previous visits, suggesting nothing had changed significantly since their last patrol. Sarah listened to the conversation while scanning the surrounding buildings for signs of threat or unusual activity. Her training had taught her to look for specific indicators: windows that remained closed when children played outside, vehicles that didn't belong, patterns of movement that suggested coordination rather than daily routine. She saw none of these signs, but she continued watching anyway because vigilance was easier to maintain than to rebuild once relaxed. The convoy moved on to the second checkpoint, then the third, each stop following the same pattern of brief interaction and cautious observation. The sun climbed higher, bringing heat that would soon make their body armor feel like ovens. Sarah had calculated her water consumption needs based on temperature projections and physical exertion levels, carrying more water than the recommended minimum because she had learned that dehydration impaired judgment long before it caused physical collapse. During their stop at the third village, Jackson made another attempt at humor at Sarah's expense. He pointed to her water bottles, both larger than standard issue, and suggested that she was overcompensating for something. The comment drew the expected chuckles from Williams and Chen, but Sarah noticed that Sergeant Davis frowned in response. Davis had seen soldiers collapse from heat exhaustion because they hadn't carried enough water, had watched good soldiers make bad decisions because dehydration clouded their thinking. The fourth checkpoint was different from the others. The village seemed quieter, with fewer people visible in the streets and no children emerging to watch their arrival. Sarah noted the change immediately, comparing it to her observations from previous patrols through this same area. The village elder, a woman named Fatima who usually greeted them with tea and conversation, was nowhere to be seen. Williams parked the Humvee in the same position they used during every visit, but something felt wrong about the familiar routine. Sarah checked her rifle, ensuring the safety was off and a round was chambered. She caught Davis watching her through the rearview mirror and saw approval in his expression. He had noticed the change in atmosphere too, the subtle wrongness that experienced soldiers learn to trust. The patrol leader decided to keep the stop brief, just long enough to confirm that the village appeared secure and undisturbed. No one emerged to speak with them, but no signs of violence or coercion were visible either. Sometimes villages were simply having bad days, dealing with internal disputes or seasonal difficulties that had nothing to do with insurgent activity. The Americans couldn't investigate every minor variation in routine without alienating the people they were trying to protect. As they prepared to leave the fourth checkpoint, Sarah noticed movement in a window on the second floor of a building that had been empty during previous visits. It was brief, just a shadow shifting behind fabric, but it was something new in a pattern she had memorized. She considered reporting it but decided against mentioning what might have been nothing more than a child playing in an abandoned room. The convoy moved on toward their final destination, a larger settlement that served as a regional center for several smaller villages. The road wound through increasingly rough terrain, with steep drops on one side and rocky walls on the other. Sarah studied the landscape with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else, noting potential defensive positions and escape routes that existed only in her careful observations. Williams had stopped making jokes as the terrain became more challenging, requiring his full attention to navigate the narrow road safely. Chen folded his map and began checking his weapon, the casual atmosphere of the earlier stops replaced by the focused attention that dangerous ground demanded. Even Jackson seemed to sense the change, his nervous energy shifting from commentary to watchfulness. The radio crackled with a transmission from the lead vehicle, reporting their approach to the final checkpoint. Estimated arrival in 15 minutes, all vehicles operational, no contact with hostile forces. Sarah made a note of the time in her notebook, maintaining the detailed record she kept of every patrol despite the fact that no one had ever asked to see it. 5 minutes later, the world exploded around them. The IED had been placed with precision, at a point where the road narrowed between two large boulders, exactly where vehicles would be forced to slow down and follow a predictable path. The explosion lifted the front of their Humvee into the air and slammed it sideways into the rocky wall. Sarah felt herself thrown against the door, then forward against her restraints, then sideways again, as the vehicle rolled partially onto its side before settling at a steep angle against the rocks. Her ears rang from the blast, but her training kicked in automatically. She checked herself for injuries, finding bruises and cuts, but nothing that would prevent her from functioning. Her rifle was still in its bracket, though the bracket itself had bent from the impact. She could hear groaning from the front seats, but no voices. No movement that suggested her teammates were responding effectively to the situation. Williams was unconscious, slumped forward against his restraints with blood running down his face from a gash above his right eye. Chen was awake but disoriented, trying to work his way out of his seatbelt with hands that shook from shock or concussion. Jackson was conscious but trapped, his leg pinned beneath debris that had shifted during the rollover. Sarah keyed her radio, hoping the communication system had survived the blast. Static answered her first attempt, then a weak signal from one of the other vehicles in the convoy. The transmission was broken and unclear, but she could make out enough to understand that their vehicle was not the only one that had been hit. Multiple casualties, multiple vehicles damaged, enemy contact likely imminent. She worked her way forward to check on Williams, finding a strong pulse despite the head wound that looked worse than it probably was. Head injuries bled extensively even when they weren't life-threatening, but she would need to keep him stable and monitor for signs of concussion or skull fracture. Chen was trying to speak, but his words were slurred and confused, suggesting he had sustained a significant head injury as well. Jackson's leg was bleeding where the debris had pinned it, but the wound appeared to be superficial despite the dramatic amount of blood. Sarah had trained as a combat medic, in addition to her regular duties, studying emergency medicine because she believed that knowledge saved lives more reliably than firepower. She began triaging her teammates, determining who needed immediate attention and who could wait. The radio crackled again, this time with a clearer transmission from Sergeant Davis in one of the other vehicles. His voice was tight with pain but controlled, professional, despite whatever injuries he had sustained. The convoy had been hit by a coordinated ambush, with IEDs targeting at least 3 of their 4 vehicles. Enemy forces were moving into position for follow-up attacks, probably hoping to overrun the damaged convoy before help could arrive. Sarah looked through the cracked windshield toward the other vehicles, trying to assess the overall situation. The lead Humvee had taken a direct hit and was burning, black smoke rising into the clear mountain air. The third vehicle appeared to be operational but was positioned awkwardly, suggesting its crew was dealing with their own casualties and damage. The trail vehicle was out of her line of sight, hidden behind the rocks and wreckage. Chen managed to work himself free from his seatbelt and was trying to climb toward the rear of the vehicle where Sarah was positioned. His movements were uncoordinated, and she could see confusion in his eyes that suggested a serious concussion. She helped him settle into a more stable position, then began checking his pupils for signs of brain injury while listening to the radio traffic that painted an increasingly grim picture of their situation. William stirred but didn't regain consciousness, his breathing steady but shallow. The head wound had stopped bleeding as heavily, but she couldn't tell how serious the underlying injury might be without equipment they didn't have and time they couldn't spare. Jackson was conscious and coherent despite his trapped leg, which meant she could count on him to follow instructions even if he couldn't move effectively. The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere ahead of their position, automatic weapons fire answered by the heavier reports of American rifles. The follow-up attack Davis had predicted was beginning, and their vehicle was out of the fight, its occupants trapped and vulnerable. Sarah tried the radio again, hoping to establish contact with whatever command authority might be coordinating their extraction. The response came not from base but from one of the helicopters that had been providing overwatch for their patrol. The pilot's voice was calm despite the situation, delivering the news that rescue was coming but would take time to arrive. Medical evacuation helicopters were being scrambled, but the landing zone would need to be secured before they could attempt a pickup. Ground reinforcements were en route but were still at least 2 hours away. 2 hours was an eternity in combat, more time than most ambushes lasted, longer than their ammunition would hold out if the enemy pressed their attack. Sarah looked at her 3 injured teammates and realized that their survival might depend on decisions she was about to make, choices that would matter more than anything she had ever done in her 22 years of life. She checked her own equipment, inventorying what she had available and what she might need. Her rifle was functional, with 6 magazines of ammunition remaining. She carried a combat medic kit with supplies for treating traumatic injuries, plus enough water and rations for extended operations. Her communications gear included both radio and backup signaling devices. Most importantly, she had studied this terrain extensively and knew every ridge, every valley, every possible route between their current position and the extraction point that helicopters would use. The gunfire was getting closer, suggesting that the enemy forces were advancing toward their position rather than simply harassing them from a distance. Sarah made her first decision, the one that would determine everything that followed. She was going to move her teammates to a more defensible position, and she was going to carry them there herself if necessary. Williams weighed probably 180 pounds, Chen maybe 160, Jackson perhaps 170. With their gear, each man represented roughly 200 pounds of dead weight that would need to be moved across difficult terrain while under enemy fire. Sarah weighed 125 pounds on her best day, but weight had never been the limiting factor in what she could accomplish. She had been preparing for this moment without knowing it, through countless hours of physical training that went beyond what was required. Through studying techniques and strategies that others considered excessive. She had been mocked for her preparation, dismissed for her thoroughness, overlooked because she didn't fit the expected profile of a combat soldier. But none of that mattered now. Her teammates needed her, and she was going to save them. Sarah began with Williams because he was the most critically injured, and because moving him would be the most difficult test of what she was about to attempt. She positioned herself beside his unconscious form, studying the angles and leverage points she would need to extract him from the damaged vehicle. The Humvee sat at a steep angle against the rocky wall, making every movement complicated by gravity and twisted metal. She had studied firemen's carries and tactical casualty evacuation techniques during her medical training, but she had also researched methods used by rescue workers in confined spaces, techniques developed for moving injured people through difficult terrain. Traditional military carries assumed that the rescuer would be larger and stronger than the casualty, assumptions that didn't apply to her situation. Instead, she employed a technique called the drag lift method, developed by mountain rescue teams for situations where traditional carries were impossible. She secured Williams's arms across his chest, then positioned herself so that his weight would be distributed across her shoulders and back, rather than requiring her to lift his full body weight. The key was leverage and physics rather than raw strength. The extraction from the vehicle took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, working him through the damaged doorframe without causing additional injuries or getting either of them trapped in the twisted metal. Williams remained unconscious throughout the process, which was both a blessing and a complication. He couldn't help with the movement, but he also couldn't resist or panic in ways that would make the process more dangerous. Once she had him clear of the vehicle, Sarah faced the challenge of moving him across nearly 300 meters of rough terrain to a position that offered better cover and a cleaner field of fire. The ground between their current location and her target destination was scattered with loose rocks, crossed by 2 small ravines, and exposed to observation from several directions where enemy forces might position themselves. She had identified the target location during her earlier study of the terrain, a cluster of large boulders that would provide protection from small arms fire while offering multiple escape routes if their position became untenable. More importantly, it was visible from the air, making it a suitable pickup point for medical evacuation helicopters when they finally arrived. Moving Williams required her to modify the drag lift technique for extended transport across uneven ground. She fashioned a makeshift harness from paracord and equipment straps, distributing his weight across her entire torso rather than concentrating it on her shoulders. The arrangement looked awkward and improvised, but it was based on load-bearing principles she had learned from studying how Sherpas carried heavy loads up mountain slopes. The first 50 meters took her nearly 15 minutes, moving in short rushes between available cover while monitoring the radio traffic that continued to paint a deteriorating picture of their overall situation. Enemy forces had been spotted moving through the valley, approaching from multiple directions in what appeared to be a coordinated effort to overrun the damaged convoy before reinforcements could arrive. Williams was dead weight, his unconscious body making no contribution to the movement process, but Sarah had calculated the energy expenditure and pacing requirements for this exact scenario during her preparation. She had conditioned herself through months of training that went far beyond what was required, carrying heavy loads over increasingly difficult terrain until the weight became manageable and the distance became routine. Between moves, she checked his pulse and breathing, monitoring for signs that his condition was deteriorating or that the movement was causing additional trauma. His vital signs remained stable, and the head wound had stopped bleeding entirely, suggesting that the injury was serious but not immediately life-threatening. She could afford to take the time necessary to move him safely, rather than rushing and risking further injury. The second leg of the journey included crossing a ravine that was only about 6 feet across, but deep enough to require careful navigation with an unconscious casualty. Sarah scouted the crossing point carefully, identifying the safest path down one side and up the other while maintaining her grip on Williams and keeping him stable during the descent and climb. She had practiced similar movements during training exercises, but never with a real casualty, and never under the stress of potential enemy contact. The crossing took almost 10 minutes, with several pauses to readjust her grip and ensure that Williams wasn't being injured by the movement. By the time she reached the other side, sweat was running down her face despite the cool mountain air. The radio crackled with updates from the other vehicles in the convoy. Sergeant Davis reported that he had managed to extract 2 casualties from the lead vehicle, but that one man was in critical condition with what appeared to be internal injuries. The third vehicle had 2 walking wounded, but was still operational and providing covering fire as enemy forces probed their perimeter. Sarah keyed her radio during a brief pause, reporting her status and intentions. She had successfully moved 1 casualty and was returning for the second. Her transmission was brief and professional, containing only essential information, delivered in the calm tone that combat communications required. She didn't mention the physical demands of what she was doing, or the time it was taking to accomplish the moves. The response came from Davis, whose voice carried a note of surprise despite his professional composure. He had assumed that Sarah would remain with the damaged vehicle, providing what medical aid she could while waiting for rescue. The idea that she was conducting individual casualty evacuations across several hundred meters of exposed ground hadn't occurred to him, partly because it seemed impossibly difficult, and partly because he had never imagined her attempting something so physically demanding. Leaving Williams in the relative safety of the boulder cluster, Sarah began the return journey to extract Chen. The trip back was faster without the burden of an unconscious casualty, but it gave her time to observe the tactical situation developing around them. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions on the ridgeline above, and the sound of gunfire was getting progressively closer as the attackers advanced. Chen was conscious when she reached the vehicle but clearly disoriented from his head injury. He recognized her but seemed confused about their situation, asking questions she had already answered, and forgetting information she had just provided. Concussion victims often experience this type of confusion, which would make moving him more complicated than moving Williams had been. She explained the situation to Chen multiple times, speaking clearly and patiently each time he forgot what she had told him. They needed to move to a safer position. She was going to help him get there. He needed to follow her instructions and trust her to guide him safely. His confusion made him compliant rather than resistant, which was fortunate given that she needed his cooperation to move him effectively. Chen was lighter than Williams and conscious enough to assist with the movement, but his disorientation made him unreliable. He would follow instructions for a few minutes, then forget what they were doing or become fixated on some irrelevant detail. Sarah had to constantly redirect his attention and remind him of their immediate goals while maintaining the physical support he needed to move across the difficult terrain. The technique she used for Chen was different from what she had employed with Williams. Since he was conscious and mobile, she could use a walking assist method that distributed his weight more efficiently, while allowing him to contribute what strength he had to the movement. She positioned herself as a human crutch, supporting his weight while guiding his steps across the uneven ground. The journey with Chen took longer than her trip with Williams, partly because of his confusion, and partly because she had to stop frequently to redirect his attention when he became distracted or disoriented. At one point, he sat down abruptly and announced that he needed to rest, forcing her to spend several minutes convincing him that they needed to keep moving and helping him regain his feet. Enemy fire was getting closer throughout their movement, with bullets occasionally striking rocks near their position. Sarah chose routes that kept them out of direct line of sight from the known enemy positions, but she knew that their window of safety was closing rapidly. The attackers were advancing methodically, and it would only be a matter of time before they reached positions from which the boulder cluster would be exposed. When they finally reached Williams, Sarah discovered that he had regained consciousness during her absence. He was alert and coherent, though obviously in pain from his injuries. His first question was about their tactical situation, delivered in the professional tone of a soldier who understood that their survival depended on accurate information and coordinated action. Sarah briefed him quickly on what she had observed during her movements. Enemy forces advancing from multiple directions, friendly casualties scattered across several positions, reinforcements still at least an hour away. Their best option was to establish a defensive position and hold until help arrived. But they needed Jackson to have any realistic chance of defending their location. Williams attempted to stand, discovered that his injuries were more serious than he had initially realized, and settled back into a position that would allow him to provide covering fire if necessary. His rifle had survived the vehicle crash, and he had enough ammunition to contribute meaningfully to their defense. More importantly, his experience and tactical knowledge would be valuable in coordinating their limited resources. Chen remained confused and disoriented, but his condition seemed to be stabilizing rather than deteriorating. Sarah positioned him where he would have some protection from enemy fire, while remaining close enough for her to monitor his medical status. She gave him specific instructions about staying low and remaining quiet, instructions she repeated several times to compensate for his short-term memory problems. The return trip to extract Jackson would be her most dangerous yet, because enemy forces had continued advancing during the time she had spent moving the first two casualties. The route she had used for her previous trips was now partially exposed to enemy observation, forcing her to plan a new approach that would take longer but offer better concealment. Jackson was conscious and alert when she reached him, though still trapped by the debris that had pinned his leg during the crash. He had managed to work his upper body free but hadn't been able to shift the heavy metal that held him in place. The leg appeared to be broken, though not severely, and the bleeding had largely stopped during the time Sarah had been away. Freeing Jackson required her to employ techniques she had learned from studying urban search and rescue operations, methods for moving heavy debris in confined spaces. She used a combination of leverage and mechanical advantage, employing pieces of equipment as improvised prying tools to shift the weight that trapped him. The process took almost 20 minutes, working carefully to avoid causing additional injury or creating a situation where debris might shift unpredictably. Jackson helped as much as his position allowed, following her instructions precisely and maintaining the calm demeanor of an experienced soldier despite his obvious pain and the deteriorating tactical situation around them. Once Jackson was free, Sarah faced the challenge of moving a casualty with a broken leg across terrain that would be difficult for an uninjured person to navigate. Traditional techniques called for improvised stretchers or drag methods that required more personnel than she had available. Instead, she employed a modified fireman's carry that distributed his weight while protecting his injured leg. Jackson was the lightest of her three casualties, but he was also conscious and in considerable pain, which made the movement process more complicated. She had to balance the need for speed against the requirement to avoid causing additional trauma to his injury. Every step required careful attention to his leg position and frequent pauses to ensure that the movement wasn't making his condition worse. The radio traffic during her movement with Jackson painted an increasingly urgent picture. Enemy forces had been spotted less than 500 meters from their position, advancing in coordinated groups that suggested training and experience. The other elements of their convoy were running low on ammunition, and several additional casualties had been reported. Sarah modified her route back to the boulder cluster, choosing a path that offered better concealment but required more physical effort to navigate with a casualty. She moved in short rushes between cover positions, pausing frequently to scan for threats and monitor Jackson's condition. His pain was obviously severe, but he maintained the disciplined silence that combat operations required. The final approach to their defensive position required crossing an exposed area where enemy observers might spot them. Sarah waited for a lull in the gunfire, then made the crossing as quickly as possible while maintaining control of Jackson's position to prevent further injury to his leg. They reached safety just as bullets began striking the rocks they had crossed moments earlier. Williams had used the time during her absence to improve their defensive position, arranging equipment and ammunition for maximum effectiveness while conserving his strength for the fighting that was coming. Chen had followed his instructions to remain low and quiet, though his confusion persisted, and he frequently asked questions about their situation. Sarah conducted a quick medical assessment of all 3 casualties, checking vital signs and examining injuries for any changes that might require immediate attention. Williams's head injury remained stable, with no signs of increasing intracranial pressure. Chen's concussion symptoms were consistent with what she had observed earlier. Jackson's leg injury was painful, but not life-threatening. The radio brought news that medical evacuation helicopters were approaching their area, but needed the landing zone to be secured before they could attempt a pickup. Ground reinforcements were still 30 minutes away, which meant that Sarah and her 3 injured teammates would have to hold their position against what appeared to be a significant enemy force. Sarah distributed ammunition and equipment to maximize their defensive capabilities. Williams, despite his head injury, was still the most experienced soldier and the best shot among them. She positioned him where he could cover the most likely avenue of enemy approach. Jackson, despite his broken leg, could still operate a rifle effectively from a prone position. Chen remained too disoriented to be trusted with a weapon, but she gave him responsibility for monitoring their radio communications and managing their medical supplies. The tasks were simple enough for his current mental state, while keeping him occupied and making him feel useful rather than helpless. Their defensive position was strong, but not impregnable. The boulder cluster provided excellent protection from small arms fire and some cover from heavier weapons, but determined attackers could eventually find ways to outflank them or bring up weapons that could penetrate their cover. Their survival would depend on how long they could hold out and how quickly help could reach them. Sarah checked her own ammunition supply and found that she had 4 full magazines remaining, plus the partial magazine in her rifle. Not enough for an extended firefight, but sufficient if they were disciplined about target selection and fire control. She had trained extensively in marksmanship, achieving scores that surpassed many of her male counterparts, despite their jokes about her size. The first enemy probe came from the northeast, 2 fighters moving cautiously between rocks about 200 meters away. Williams spotted them first, tracking their movement through his rifle scope while waiting for them to present clear targets. Sarah watched through binoculars, noting their equipment and tactics while estimating the size of the force they represented. The enemy fighters were well equipped and moved with the coordination of experienced combatants. They were conducting reconnaissance rather than launching an immediate attack, gathering information about the American position before committing to a full assault. Sarah counted at least 6 individuals during the probe, but the disciplined nature of their movement suggested a larger force remained hidden. Williams held his fire during the initial probe, allowing the enemy scouts to gather some information while avoiding revealing the exact nature of their defensive capabilities. It was a calculated risk based on his experience with similar situations. Better to let the enemy think they were dealing with a damaged convoy element that might not be able to defend itself effectively. The radio brought updates from the approaching helicopter crews. Medical evacuation aircraft were 5 minutes out but needed confirmation that the landing zone was secure before they would commit to the approach. Ground reinforcements had encountered delays and were now estimated to be 40 minutes away. The timeline was getting tighter, and their defensive requirements were becoming more demanding. Sarah made preparations for casualty loading when the helicopters arrived, organizing medical information and ensuring that Williams, Chen, and Jackson would be ready for immediate transport. She had maintained detailed notes on each man's injuries and treatment throughout their ordeal, information that would be valuable to the medical teams who would continue their care. The second enemy probe was more aggressive, with fighters approaching from 2 directions simultaneously while maintaining covering fire from concealed positions. Williams engaged the nearest target, his shot dropping one attacker immediately while forcing the others to seek cover. Sarah engaged targets from a different angle, coordinating their fire to prevent the enemy from gaining ground. Jackson contributed what he could from his prone position, though his broken leg limited his mobility and made it difficult for him to track moving targets. Chen remained focused on radio communications, relaying information between their position and the incoming helicopters while managing their medical supplies according to Sarah's instructions. The coordinated defense was more effective than their individual capabilities should have allowed. Williams provided experienced leadership and accurate long-range shooting. Sarah contributed tactical flexibility and precise fire at shorter ranges. Jackson offered additional firepower despite his injuries. Even Chen made important contributions through his communication and support duties. The enemy attack intensified as more fighters joined the assault, recognizing that they faced organized resistance rather than helpless casualties. Automatic weapons fire forced the Americans to remain behind cover for extended periods, limiting their ability to engage targets effectively. Sarah could hear movement sounds that suggested the attackers were attempting to outflank their position. Radio traffic from the helicopters indicated that they were approaching the landing zone but were receiving ground fire from enemy positions. The aircraft would need the immediate area to be clear of threats before they could land safely. Sarah realized that their defensive mission was expanding beyond simply holding their position to actively clearing enemy forces from the landing zone. Williams was thinking along the same lines, recognizing that passive defense would not be sufficient to ensure the helicopters could complete their mission. He began engaging enemy positions that posed threats to the aircraft, rather than focusing only on targets that directly threatened their defensive position. Sarah adjusted her own fire to support his targeting priorities. The sound of helicopter rotors became audible over the gunfire, growing louder as the aircraft approached their position. Sarah could see dust being kicked up by rotor wash as the helicopters maneuvered for their approach to the landing zone. The enemy fire intensified in response, recognizing that this was their last opportunity to prevent the American casualties from being evacuated. Sarah found herself at the center of a tactical situation that required split-second decisions about target priorities and resource allocation. She was coordinating defensive fire, preparing casualties for evacuation, maintaining communication with multiple elements, and making medical decisions about the treatment priorities for her teammates. None of her training had prepared her for the complexity of managing all these responsibilities simultaneously. But she had always been methodical, always been thorough, always been prepared for contingencies that others considered unlikely. The same careful planning that had earned her mockery from her teammates was now providing the foundation for decisions that would determine whether they all survived the next few minutes. The helicopter was on final approach, rotors thundering overhead as it descended toward the landing zone. Enemy fire was converging on the aircraft from multiple positions, forcing the pilot to take evasive action that complicated the landing approach. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different enemy positions, all focusing their fire on the vulnerable helicopter. Williams was engaging the nearest enemy position with rapid, accurate fire that forced the attackers to keep their heads down. Sarah shifted her attention to a different target, one that posed the most direct threat to the helicopter's approach path. Her shots were precise and controlled, each round carefully aimed to maximize effect while conserving ammunition. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, its crew immediately deploying to establish security around the aircraft, while medical personnel prepared to receive casualties. Sarah could see the professionalism and speed with which they operated, every movement efficient and purposeful despite the enemy fire that continued to target their position. Loading the casualties would require moving them from their defensive position to the helicopter, a distance of about 50 meters across ground that was partially exposed to enemy fire. Sarah had planned for this contingency, identifying the safest route and preparing equipment that would allow rapid movement while maintaining medical support for the injured men. The helicopter crew chief was shouting instructions over the rotor noise, his voice barely audible above the thundering engines and the crack of incoming rounds. Sarah could see the urgency in his movements as he gestured toward the aircraft, indicating that they had perhaps 90 seconds on the ground before enemy fire would force them to abort the pickup attempt. Williams tried to stand, his determination overriding the obvious pain from his head injury, but his legs buckled after 2 steps. The concussion had affected his balance more severely than any of them had realized during the defensive fighting. He looked at Sarah with frustration and something approaching desperation, recognizing that his inability to move under his own power might doom all of them. Chen was on his feet but swaying, his disorientation making him unreliable for any movement that required coordination or speed. He kept asking the same questions about what was happening, unable to retain information for more than a few seconds. Jackson remained prone, his broken leg making any attempt at walking impossible, despite his obvious desire to contribute to their escape. The helicopter crew was taking fire from multiple directions, forcing the door gunners to divide their attention between suppressing enemy positions and maintaining security around the landing zone. Sarah could see the pilot's tension through the cockpit glass as he fought to keep the aircraft stable, despite the shifting winds created by the surrounding mountains and the impact of bullets against the armored hull. Enemy forces were advancing more aggressively now, recognizing that this was their final opportunity to prevent the American casualties from escaping. Sarah counted muzzle flashes from at least 8 different positions, suggesting that the attacking force was larger than they had initially estimated. The defensive position that had seemed adequate for holding against probing attacks was becoming untenable against a coordinated assault. The crew chief made eye contact with Sarah and pointed toward Williams, indicating that they should begin moving casualties to the aircraft immediately. His expression conveyed urgency without panic, the controlled intensity of someone who had conducted similar operations under fire many times before. Sarah nodded her understanding and began the process that would determine whether any of them survived the next few minutes. She positioned herself beside Williams, who was still conscious but clearly unable to support his own weight for the distance they needed to travel. The route to the helicopter was exposed to fire from at least 3 enemy positions, requiring speed and coordination to minimize their time in the open. Sarah had studied the terrain during their defensive preparations, identifying the safest path and planning the movement sequence. The technique she employed was a modified combat carry that distributed Williams's weight across her shoulders and back, while maintaining her ability to move quickly across uneven ground. She had practiced similar carries during training, but never with live ammunition flying overhead, and never with the knowledge that failure would result in death for both her and her casualty. Williams was heavier than he had seemed during their earlier defensive preparations, his dead weight complicated by equipment and the awkward positioning required by his injuries. Sarah adjusted her grip and stance, finding the balance point that would allow her to move efficiently while protecting both of them from enemy fire. The crew chief watched their approach with professional attention, ready to assist with the loading process. The 50-meter movement to the helicopter felt like the longest distance Sarah had ever traveled. Enemy rounds kicked up dust around their feet and whined off the rocks beside the landing zone. She moved in a series of rushes between available cover, pausing only long enough to readjust her grip on Williams and ensure that he wasn't being injured by the rapid movement. The helicopter crew received Williams with the efficient professionalism of experienced medical personnel, transferring him to a stretcher and beginning immediate assessment of his injuries while maintaining their own defensive positions. Sarah barely paused before turning back toward the defensive position where Chen and Jackson waited, knowing that the aircraft's time on the ground was measured in seconds rather than minutes. Chen was standing when she reached him, but his confusion had worsened during the stress of the firefight. He seemed unable to understand why they needed to move quickly, or what the helicopter represented in terms of their survival. Sarah took his arm and began guiding him toward the aircraft, speaking clearly and calmly despite the chaos around them. The journey with Chen required different techniques than moving Williams had demanded. Since Chen was mobile but unreliable, Sarah positioned herself as both guide and support, ready to carry his full weight if his confusion caused him to stumble or freeze. She maintained a steady stream of simple instructions, repeating information as many times as necessary to keep him focused on the immediate task. Enemy fire intensified as they crossed the open ground, forcing Sarah to shield Chen with her own body while maintaining their forward progress. Bullets struck the ground inches from their feet, and she could hear the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to her head. Chen seemed oblivious to the danger, his attention focused on following her instructions rather than understanding the larger situation. The crew chief was waiting at the aircraft door, ready to pull Chen aboard the moment they reached the helicopter. The transfer was accomplished in seconds, with medical personnel immediately beginning their assessment, while Sarah turned back toward Jackson's position. She was breathing hard now, the accumulated stress and physical demands of the evacuations taking their toll despite her conditioning. Jackson presented the most complex challenge because his broken leg made normal movement impossible, while his consciousness and upper body strength offered opportunities for him to assist with his own evacuation. Sarah had planned a modified drag technique that would protect his injured leg while allowing rapid movement across the exposed ground. The enemy assault was reaching its climax as fighters advanced from multiple directions, recognizing that this was their final opportunity to overrun the American position. The helicopter's door gunners were firing continuously, their heavy weapons providing suppressive fire that forced the attackers to move cautiously rather than rushing the landing zone. Sarah could hear the pilot's voice over the radio, reporting that they were taking heavy fire and requesting immediate clearance for departure. Jackson was ready when she reached him, Having prepared himself mentally for the movement, despite the obvious pain from his injury, he had fashioned a makeshift splint for his leg using equipment from their defensive position, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that Sarah had always respected in experienced soldiers. His preparation would make the evacuation faster and safer for both of them. The technique she used for Jackson was a combination of drag and carry methods, with him contributing what strength he could while she provided the primary motive force for their movement. His injured leg was protected by the improvised splint, but every step caused obvious pain that he absorbed without complaint. Sarah maintained steady pressure on their movement, knowing that speed was more important than comfort at this stage. The final 50 meters to the helicopter were the most dangerous yet, with enemy forces having closed to within effective range of the landing zone. Automatic weapons fire raked the ground around them, forcing Sarah to choose between speed and concealment as she guided Jackson towards safety. She chose speed, trusting in her conditioning and determination to cover the distance before enemy marksmanship could find its target. Bullets whined overhead and struck the ground beside them as they crossed the open area. Sarah could feel the heat of rounds passing close enough to singe the fabric of her uniform. Jackson maintained his grip on her shoulders despite the pain from his injury, understanding that his survival depended on their coordination and her strength to carry them both to safety. The helicopter crew was ready for their arrival, hands reaching out to pull Jackson aboard the moment they reached the aircraft door. Medical personnel immediately began working on his leg injury, while the crew chief prepared for immediate departure. Sarah started to follow Jackson into the aircraft, then realized that someone needed to provide security for the loading process. She turned back toward the defensive position, her rifle ready, providing covering fire while the helicopter crew completed their preparations for departure. Enemy fighters were visible among the rocks, advancing steadily despite the suppressive fire from the aircraft's guns. Sarah's shots were carefully aimed and controlled, each round intended to force the attackers to seek cover, rather than simply spraying ammunition toward their general position. The crew chief grabbed her shoulder and shouted over the engine noise that they needed to leave immediately. The pilot was reporting multiple hits on the aircraft's hull, and fuel levels were becoming a concern for their return flight to base. Sarah nodded her understanding but continued firing, recognizing that the helicopter needed every second of covering fire she could provide. Her final shots were fired as she backed toward the aircraft door, maintaining her defensive position until the last possible moment. The crew chief physically pulled her aboard as the helicopter began lifting off, enemy rounds striking the landing zone where they had been positioned seconds earlier. Sarah found herself lying across the floor of the aircraft, still clutching her rifle, as the medical team worked frantically on her 3 teammates. The helicopter climbed rapidly, seeking altitude that would take them out of range of enemy small arms fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions on the ground as the attackers continued firing at the departing aircraft. The pilot was maneuvering aggressively, using the mountain terrain to break line of sight with enemy positions while maintaining enough speed to avoid shoulder-fired missiles. Williams was unconscious again, but his vital signs appeared stable on the medical monitors. The flight medic was conducting a more thorough examination of his head injury, checking for signs of skull fracture or brain trauma that might require immediate surgical intervention. Chen remained confused and disoriented, but his condition seemed to be improving slightly as the stress of combat subsided. Jackson was fully conscious and alert, despite the obvious pain from his leg injury. The flight medic had administered pain medication and was stabilizing the fracture for transport to definitive medical care. Jackson caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of gratitude that needed no words to convey its meaning. The radio crackled with transmissions from ground forces that were finally approaching the ambush site. Reinforcements had arrived to find the convoy positions abandoned except for equipment and empty vehicles. Enemy forces had withdrawn after the helicopter departure, leaving behind evidence of their presence but no casualties or prisoners to provide intelligence about their organization or objectives. Sarah sat against the aircraft's bulkhead, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion that had been building throughout their ordeal. Her uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cool mountain air, and her hands shook slightly from the adrenaline that was beginning to fade. She had carried 3 men to safety across difficult terrain under enemy fire, accomplishing something that should have been impossible for someone of her size and build. The flight medic approached her with medical equipment, intending to conduct an assessment for injuries she might have sustained during the evacuation process. Sarah initially resisted, insisting that her teammates needed attention more than she did, but the medic's professional persistence convinced her to submit to examination. The assessment revealed multiple bruises and minor cuts, but no serious injuries despite the physical demands she had endured. The helicopter's communication system brought updates from the base hospital, where medical teams were preparing to receive the casualties. Williams would need immediate evaluation for potential brain injury, Chen would require monitoring for concussion symptoms, and Jackson needed surgical repair of his leg fracture. All three men were expected to make full recoveries, with return to duty anticipated within several months. Sarah listened to the medical discussions with the detached attention of someone who had done everything possible and was now waiting for others to take responsibility. She had planned for this evacuation, trained for these physical demands, and executed the mission with precision that surprised even her. The techniques she had studied and practiced in isolation had proven effective under the most demanding circumstances possible. The mountain landscape scrolled past below them, peaceful and beautiful in the afternoon light, despite the violence that had taken place among its ridges and valleys. Sarah watched the terrain with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else, noting features and landmarks that might be relevant to future operations in the area. Williams stirred as the helicopter approached the base, regaining consciousness as the effects of his concussion began to diminish. His first words were questions about the status of his teammates, delivered in the professional tone that never completely left experienced soldiers, even when they were patients rather than fighters. The flight medic briefed him on everyone's condition, while monitoring his responses for signs of cognitive impairment. Chen's confusion was gradually clearing as well, though he still had significant gaps in his memory about recent events. He recognized Sarah and seemed to understand that she had been instrumental in their rescue, but he couldn't recall specific details about how they had reached the helicopter or what had happened during the firefight. The flight medic explained that short-term memory problems were common after concussion and would likely improve over time. Jackson remained fully alert and coherent throughout the flight, his military bearing intact despite his injury and the pain medication he had received. He watched Sarah with an expression that combined gratitude with something approaching awe, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time despite having served alongside her for months. The base came into view as the helicopter crested the final ridge, its concrete barriers and guard towers looking like symbols of safety and civilization after the harsh wilderness where they had been fighting for their lives. Medical teams were waiting on the landing pad, ready to receive casualties and begin the treatment process that would restore her teammates to full health and capability. Sarah prepared to accompany her teammates to the hospital, intending to provide medical information and support their treatment process. She had maintained detailed records throughout their ordeal, documenting injuries and treatment in the methodical way that had become second nature to her. The information would be valuable to the doctors who would continue their care. The landing was smooth despite the damage the helicopter had sustained during the rescue operation. Ground crews immediately began assessing the aircraft for battle damage, while medical personnel transferred the casualties to waiting stretchers. Sarah walked beside Williams as he was moved toward the hospital, ready to brief the medical team on his condition and treatment. The base hospital was a modern facility with equipment and capabilities that rivaled civilian trauma centers. Williams, Chen, and Jackson were quickly transferred to examination rooms where teams of doctors and nurses began comprehensive assessments of their injuries. Sarah provided detailed briefings to each medical team, her careful documentation proving valuable for treatment planning. Williams's head injury was less severe than initially feared, with no evidence of skull fracture or significant brain trauma. His concussion symptoms were expected to resolve completely within a few weeks, and his return to duty was anticipated without any permanent limitations. The medical team credited Sarah's careful monitoring and appropriate field treatment with preventing complications that might have resulted from inadequate care. Chen's concussion was more serious, but still within the range of injuries that typically resolved without permanent effects. His memory problems were expected to improve gradually, and cognitive testing showed no signs of lasting impairment. The doctors emphasized the importance of rest and gradual return to normal activities, but they were optimistic about his complete recovery. Jackson's leg fracture was straightforward, requiring surgical repair but presenting no complications that would prevent full recovery. The improvised splint he had fashioned had protected the injury during transport, and Sarah's careful handling during the evacuation had prevented additional damage. Surgery was scheduled for the following day, with expectations of complete healing and return to normal function. After briefing the medical teams, Sarah found herself in the unusual position of having nothing immediate to do. Her teammates were receiving appropriate care, the mission was complete, and her detailed reports had been submitted through proper channels. She sat in the hospital waiting area, still wearing her combat gear, trying to process what had happened over the past several hours. Other soldiers from their unit began arriving at the hospital as word of the ambush spread through the base. They came to check on their wounded teammates and to understand what had happened during the attack. Sarah answered their questions with the same factual precision she brought to everything else, describing events without drama or self-promotion. The conversations gradually revealed that news of her actions was spreading beyond their immediate unit. The helicopter crew had filed reports describing her evacuation of 3 casualties under fire, emphasizing the physical demands and tactical complexity of what she had accomplished. Base personnel who had never paid attention to her before were now showing interest in her capabilities and background. Sarah was uncomfortable with the attention, preferring the anonymity that had characterized her service up to this point. She had not evacuated her teammates for recognition or praise, but because it was necessary and because she was capable of doing it. The mission had required specific skills and physical capabilities that she possessed, and she had employed them effectively to achieve the desired outcome. Late in the evening, she was summoned to meet with the battalion commander, a colonel with extensive combat experience who wanted to discuss her actions during the ambush. Sarah reported to his office in her clean duty uniform, having finally been released from the hospital after her own medical evaluation was completed. The colonel's questions were detailed and specific, focusing on her decision-making process and the techniques she had employed during the casualty evacuations. He was particularly interested in her preparation and training, wanting to understand how she had developed the capabilities that had proven so crucial during the crisis. Sarah answered honestly, describing the additional training she had pursued and the planning she had conducted. The conversation revealed that her actions were being considered for formal recognition, possibly including awards that would acknowledge her performance under fire. Sarah listened to this information with the same composed attention she brought to all briefings, neither seeking such recognition nor rejecting it if her superiors deemed it appropriate. More importantly, the colonel indicated that her demonstrated capabilities would likely result in additional responsibilities and opportunities within the unit. Her combination of medical training, physical conditioning, and tactical competence represented exactly the kind of versatility that modern military operations required. Sarah nodded her understanding while maintaining her characteristic professional demeanor. The interview concluded with the colonel's expression of gratitude for her service and his confidence in her future contributions to the unit. Sarah saluted appropriately and departed, walking through the base toward her quarters with the same steady pace that had carried her through every challenge she had faced. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of mountain vegetation and the distant sound of helicopters conducting routine operations. Sarah paused outside the hospital to look up at the stars that were becoming visible in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new challenges, but tonight her teammates were safe and recovering, because she had been prepared when preparation mattered most. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood at attention in the base commander's office, her dress uniform crisp and perfectly fitted, despite the challenges that military tailors always faced with her smaller frame. The office was formal and imposing, with flags representing various commands and photographs of previous commanders creating an atmosphere of military tradition and authority. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. General Morrison sat behind his desk, reviewing a folder thick with documentation, witness statements, and medical reports. His gray hair and weathered face spoke of decades of military service, and his expression carried the gravity of someone who understood the weight of the decisions he made. Beside him sat Colonel Hayes, Sarah's battalion commander, along with several other officers whose presence indicated the significance of this meeting. The folder contained more than just the official reports from the ambush. Medical personnel had documented the extent of injuries sustained by Williams, Chen, and Jackson, along with detailed analyses of how those injuries might have progressed without immediate and appropriate field care. Helicopter crew members had provided sworn statements describing the tactical situation during the evacuation and the physical demands of moving 3 casualties under enemy fire. Most significantly, military physicians had conducted studies of the physical requirements for Sarah's actions, calculating the strength, endurance, and technique necessary to accomplish what she had done. Their findings challenged assumptions about size and capability that had influenced military thinking for generations. The documentation painted a picture of performance that exceeded expectations by such wide margins that it demanded formal recognition. General Morrison looked up from the papers, his eyes meeting Sarah's with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating soldiers under the most demanding circumstances. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of rank, but also something warmer, a recognition of exceptional service that transcended normal military protocols. "Sergeant Martinez," he began, using her new rank for the first time in an official setting. The promotion had been processed through expedited channels, recognizing that her actions had demonstrated leadership and competence far beyond her previous pay grade. The documentation in this folder describes performance that represents the highest traditions of military service. Sarah maintained her position at attention, her expression calm and professional despite the significance of the moment. She had learned weeks earlier that formal recognition was being considered, but she had approached this meeting with the same methodical preparation she brought to everything else. She had studied the regulations governing military awards and understood the criteria that her actions would be measured against. The general continued, lifting a blue folder from his desk that contained the official orders for her decoration. The Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor is awarded to individuals who demonstrate heroic or meritorious service in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle in the room. Your actions during the ambush operation meet those criteria and exceed them significantly. The citation that followed was read aloud by Colonel Hayes, his voice carrying the formal tone required by military protocol while conveying genuine respect for the actions being recognized. The language was precise and official, documenting locations, times, and tactical circumstances with the accuracy that military records demanded. But beneath the formal structure lay a story of courage and competence that had saved 3 lives. Sergeant Martinez repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to evacuate wounded personnel across difficult terrain, the citation stated. Her actions required exceptional physical capability, tactical knowledge, and personal courage under the most demanding combat conditions. Through her efforts, 3 critically wounded soldiers received life-saving medical care and were successfully extracted from an untenable tactical situation. Sarah listened to the formal recognition of her actions with the same composed attention she had brought to countless briefings and training sessions. The words accurately described what had happened, but they could not convey the months of preparation that had made those actions possible, the ridicule she had endured from teammates who questioned her capabilities, or the quiet satisfaction of proving that dedication and competence mattered more than size or conformity to expected norms. Williams, Chen, and Jackson were present for the ceremony, having returned to duty after their medical treatment and recovery. Williams showed no lasting effects from his concussion, having passed all cognitive and physical assessments required for return to combat operations. Chen had recovered completely from his head injury, with no memory problems or other complications. Jackson's leg had healed perfectly, restoring full function and mobility. All 3 men had requested permission to attend the award ceremony, recognizing that their presence would add significance to the recognition of Sarah's actions. They stood in the front row of assembled personnel, their expressions reflecting gratitude that went far beyond military courtesy. They understood better than anyone else what her capabilities had meant for their survival and future. The medal itself was presented with the ceremony that military tradition required, but the moment felt different from routine award presentations. General Morrison's handshake lingered longer than protocol demanded, and his words carried personal warmth that transcended formal recognition. "Thank you, Sergeant Martinez," he said quietly. "Your service exemplifies everything we hope to achieve through military training and leadership development." After the formal ceremony concluded, the assembled personnel gradually dispersed, but several officers approached Sarah individually to express their congratulations and respect. These conversations were different from the interactions she had experienced previously, characterized by genuine professional recognition rather than the patronizing or dismissive attitudes that had been common before her demonstrated performance. Major Thompson, the battalion operations officer, discussed opportunities for advanced training that would build on her demonstrated capabilities. The military had identified her combination of medical knowledge, physical conditioning, and tactical competence as exactly the kind of versatility needed for future operations. Specialized schools and assignments were available that would allow her to develop these skills further. Captain Rodriguez from the Medical Command wanted to discuss her field treatment techniques and documentation methods. The detailed records she had maintained during the casualty evacuations had provided valuable data for improving combat medical protocols. Her systematic approach to patient care under fire had revealed opportunities for enhancing training programs and equipment design. The conversations continued through the afternoon, with Sarah finding herself at the center of professional discussions that treated her as an expert rather than an anomaly. Officers who had never previously shown interest in her opinions were now seeking her input on training methods, equipment selection, and tactical procedures. The change in attitude was dramatic and complete. Evening brought a more informal gathering at the unit's recreation facility, where off-duty personnel traditionally celebrated significant events. Sarah initially intended to avoid the social aspects of the day, preferring the privacy of her quarters to the complexity of navigating changed relationships with her teammates. But Williams had specifically requested her presence, and she respected his judgment enough to attend. The atmosphere in the recreation facility was different from previous social gatherings. Sarah had always been present but peripheral at such events, tolerated rather than welcomed, included but not valued. Tonight, she found herself at the center of conversations, with soldiers actively seeking her participation rather than working around her presence. Jackson approached her with 2 bottles of beer, offering one while settling into the chair beside her. His leg showed no signs of the injury that had threatened his career just weeks earlier, and his expression reflected gratitude that had deepened rather than faded over time. "I never thanked you properly," he said, his voice carrying the sincerity of someone who understood the magnitude of what had been done for him. Sarah accepted the beer but redirected the conversation away from personal gratitude, uncomfortable with individual recognition for actions she considered necessary rather than exceptional. "You would have done the same thing," she replied, though they both knew that the physical demands of what she had accomplished were beyond the capabilities of most soldiers regardless of their courage or determination. Chen joined the conversation, bringing with him several other soldiers who wanted to discuss the tactical aspects of the evacuation operation. Their questions were technical and professional, focusing on decision-making processes and execution techniques rather than personal heroism. Sarah found this approach more comfortable, allowing her to share knowledge and experience without feeling like the subject of inappropriate attention. The discussion expanded to include broader topics about unit training and operational procedures. Several soldiers expressed interest in the additional physical conditioning that had enabled Sarah's performance, wanting to understand how they might improve their own capabilities. Others asked about her medical training and the documentation methods that had proven so valuable during the crisis. Williams eventually called for attention from the assembled group, rising from his chair with the authority that came naturally to him despite his relatively junior rank. The room quieted as soldiers recognized that he had something important to say, and Sarah felt a moment of anxiety about becoming the focus of group attention. "Most of you know what happened out there," Williams began, his voice carrying across the room without strain. "Some of you have read the reports or heard the stories. But I want to make sure everyone understands something important." He paused, looking directly at Sarah before continuing. "We're alive because of preparation and competence, not luck or accident." The room remained quiet as Williams continued, his words carrying the weight of someone who had experienced combat and understood the difference between heroism and Hollywood dramatics. Sergeant Martinez didn't suddenly develop superhuman abilities when we needed them. She had been training for that situation for months, preparing for contingencies that the rest of us never considered. Sarah listened with growing discomfort as Williams described her preparation methods and training regimen, details that she had never discussed openly but that he had observed over months of shared service. His words painted a picture of dedication that went far beyond military requirements, of someone who had prepared for responsibilities that others had never expected her to assume. "While we were making jokes about her size and her equipment," Williams said, his voice carrying a note of self-criticism that was clearly painful, "she was studying terrain maps and casualty evacuation techniques. While we were assuming she couldn't keep up, she was conditioning herself to carry all of us if necessary." The room remained completely silent as Williams concluded his remarks, his final words carrying a challenge that every soldier present understood. She never asked for recognition or special treatment. She just did the work and prepared for the mission. That's the standard we should all be meeting, and most of us aren't even close. The conversation that followed Williams's remarks was more subdued, but also more genuine than typical social interactions in military settings. Soldiers approached Sarah individually, asking specific questions about training methods and preparation techniques. The tone was respectful and professional, recognizing expertise rather than celebrating celebrity. Sergeant Davis, the senior enlisted man in their unit, spent considerable time discussing leadership philosophy and the relationship between preparation and performance. His experience with multiple deployments had taught him to recognize authentic competence, and he expressed genuine respect for the systematic approach that had characterized Sarah's service from the beginning. The evening gradually wound down as soldiers returned to their quarters or other activities, but several individuals lingered to continue conversations that had taken on significance beyond casual socializing. Sarah found herself in discussions about military careers, training opportunities, and the changing nature of combat operations that required versatility and adaptability rather than simple physical size. Major Thompson returned to the conversation about advanced training opportunities, providing specific details about schools and assignments that would allow Sarah to develop her capabilities further. The military had identified a need for personnel who could bridge traditional boundaries between combat operations, medical support, and tactical leadership. Her demonstrated performance suggested that she might be ideal for such roles. The discussion revealed opportunities that Sarah had never considered during her previous service. Specialized units needed personnel with her combination of skills and demonstrated performance under pressure. Training programs existed that would formalize and expand the knowledge she had developed through individual study and preparation. Career paths were available that would value her systematic approach and technical competence. Late in the evening, after most of the group had dispersed, Sarah found herself in conversation with Williams, Chen, and Jackson. The four of them sat around a small table, the noise and activity of the earlier gathering replaced by the quiet intimacy of people who had shared significant experiences together. "Things are going to be different now," Williams said, his statement carrying multiple meanings that all of them understood. The dynamics within their unit had changed permanently, but so had broader perceptions about capability and performance that would influence Sarah's future service. The recognition she had received would open doors that had previously been closed while creating expectations that would need to be met. Chen nodded his agreement, adding his own perspective about the changes that formal recognition would bring. "People are going to be watching to see if this was a one-time thing or if it represents something more significant." His words carried no pressure or expectation, just an acknowledgement of the reality that exceptional performance created ongoing responsibilities. Jackson's contribution to the conversation was more personal, reflecting the gratitude that he continued to feel for his survival and recovery. "I know you don't want to be treated differently," he said, looking directly at Sarah, "but you need to understand that what you did matters beyond just saving our lives. You proved something important about dedication and competence that other people need to learn from." Sarah listened to their perspectives with the same thoughtful attention she brought to all important conversations, recognizing that their insights were valuable for understanding how her service would continue to evolve. The formal recognition was significant, but the changed relationships and expectations would have more lasting impact on her military career. The conversation eventually turned to practical matters about their unit's future operations and training programs. All four soldiers would likely be assigned to different positions that reflected their demonstrated capabilities and the lessons learned from their shared experience. Sarah's new rank and recognition would qualify her for leadership positions that had previously been unavailable. As the evening concluded, Sarah walked back to her quarters through the quiet base, passing buildings and facilities that had become familiar during her months of service. The physical environment remained unchanged, but her relationship to it had been transformed by recognition of capabilities that had always existed but had never been properly valued. Her quarters were simple and functional, reflecting the practical approach she brought to all aspects of her life. The walls displayed maps and training materials rather than personal photographs or decorations, creating an environment focused on professional development rather than comfort or entertainment. She sat at her desk and opened the folder containing information about advanced training opportunities. The programs described in the materials represented exactly the kind of challenges that had always motivated her. Specialized schools that taught advanced medical procedures, tactical leadership courses that emphasized decision-making under pressure, and assignment opportunities that would allow her to apply her skills in new and demanding contexts. Each option required extensive preparation and demonstrated competence. Sarah spent several hours reviewing the materials, taking notes and comparing requirements with her current qualifications and future goals. The systematic approach that had characterized her previous training would be equally valuable for navigating these new opportunities. She began developing plans for additional preparation that would ensure her readiness for whatever challenges lay ahead. The Bronze Star medal sat in its presentation case on her desk, the blue ribbon and bronze star catching light from the reading lamp. The decoration represented formal recognition of her actions, but it also symbolized validation of the approach to service that had guided her career from the beginning. Preparation, competence, and dedication had proven more valuable than size, volume, or conformity to expected norms. Outside her window, the base continued its around-the-clock operations, with personnel conducting training exercises, maintaining equipment, and preparing for missions that would test their capabilities under demanding circumstances. Sarah understood that she was now part of that larger mission in ways that had not been possible before her demonstrated performance. She made final notes about her training plans and closed the folder, satisfied that she had developed a clear path forward. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and opportunities, but she felt prepared to meet them with the same methodical approach that had carried her through every previous challenge. The metal case reflected her image as she turned off the desk lamp, creating a moment of quiet satisfaction that few people ever experience. She had proven to herself and others that excellence was achievable through dedication and preparation, regardless of initial expectations or limitations. The recognition was gratifying, but the knowledge of her own capabilities was more valuable than any external validation. Before settling in for the night, Sarah reviewed her notebook one final time, checking the detailed plans she had developed for continued improvement and growth. The pages contained schedules for additional training, goals for skill development, and timelines for pursuing new opportunities. Each entry reflected the same careful planning that had enabled her remarkable performance under fire. Her teammates were safe and recovering because she had been prepared when preparation mattered most. Her unit was stronger because she had demonstrated that competence could come in unexpected forms. Her own future was brighter because she had proven that dedication and hard work could overcome any initial disadvantage or limitation. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The months of ridicule and dismissal had been painful but not destructive. The additional training and preparation had been demanding but ultimately rewarding. The test of her capabilities under fire had been terrifying, but had provided the validation that made everything else worthwhile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she rested with the satisfaction of knowing that she had met every test and exceeded every expectation. The Bronze Star Medal represented not just recognition of past actions, but promise of future service that would continue to exemplify the highest standards of military excellence. In the quiet darkness of her quarters, surrounded by the materials and equipment that supported her continued preparation, Sarah Martinez settled into sleep with the confidence of someone who had proven herself under the most demanding circumstances possible. She had carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety, but more importantly, she had carried herself beyond every limitation that others had tried to impose. The base hummed with quiet activity around her, but her rest was deep and peaceful, unmarked by the doubts or insecurities that had once troubled her sleep. She had found her place in the military through competence rather than compliance, through preparation rather than politics, through service that spoke louder than any words could ever convey. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.